The 23rd of March, 1945, dawned cold and unforgiving across the shattered landscape of Germany's Rhineland, where the stench of cordite and death hung thick in the air like an unwelcome fog. Amid the chaos of the Allied advance, a sound pierced through the artillery thunder not human, but achingly familiar to anyone who had ever known loyalty in its purest form, the desperate howling of a dog refusing to abandon his post. Staff Sergeant William Harrington of the 91st Infantry Division crouched behind a crumbled stone wall, his ears picking up something unusual between the stuttering bursts of machine gun fire. The sound was persistent, mournful, and somehow defiant all at once. He signaled to his Squad 5 battle-hardened men, whose faces bore the thousand-yard stares of those who had fought from Normandy to the German heartland. What they discovered in a bomb crater 30 yards ahead would become one of the most remarkable stories of canine devotion ever recorded in wartime documentation. Two German shepherd dogs lay in the muddy depression, one clearly dead from shrapnel wounds, the other a magnificent specimen with intelligent dark eyes positioned protectively over his fallen companion. The living dog's right foreleg hung at an unnatural angle and blood matted his thick coat. Yet he bared his teeth at the approaching American soldiers with the fierce determination of a warrior who had chosen his hill to die on. "Easy there, boy," Harrington whispered, lowering his rifle. He had grown up on a farm in rural Pennsylvania, where dogs were more than animals. They were family, workmates, and friends. This German shepherd, despite wearing the collar markings of Wehrmacht service, was clearly cut from the same cloth as the farm dogs of his youth, utterly devoted, unflinchingly brave, and bound by a code of loyalty that transcended nationality or uniform. The dog whose collar bore the name Rex stamped in worn leather growled low in his throat, but his eyes told a different story. Pain clouded those dark depths, and beneath the aggression lay something Harrington recognized immediately: grief. This was not the snarl of a vicious attack dog, but the desperate warning of a mourner standing vigil over his fallen brother in arms. Private Thomas O'Brien, the squad's youngest member at just 19 years old, slowly reached into his pack and withdrew a piece of hardtack. He broke it carefully, extending it toward Rex with steady hands that had learned patience on the streets of Boston, where stray dogs were as common as cobblestones. Rex's nostrils flared, catching the scent, but still he did not move from his position over the dead shepherd. The scene before them represented a microcosm of war's greater tragedy: two beings trained for violence, caught in circumstances beyond their control, their only crime being loyalty to those who commanded them. The dead dog's fur was matted with dried blood and mud, his eyes glazed in the unseeing stare of death. Documentation from various military archives, including accounts preserved in the National Archives and Records Administration, confirms that German military dogs were extensively trained in tracking, patrol work, and guard duties throughout the Second World War, often forming unbreakable bonds with their handlers and fellow canines. Rex's breathing came in shallow pants, each exhalation visible in the cold morning air. As Corporal James Mitchell approached with the squad's medical kit, Rex's ears flattened against his skull, and a deep rumble emanated from his chest, not quite a growl, more a warning that he retained enough strength to defend what mattered most to him. Mitchell, a veterinarian's assistant in civilian life from rural Montana, recognized the signs of shock and blood loss. Time was running short for this remarkable animal, yet the dog's determination seemed to defy his body's failing systems. "We need to move fast," Mitchell said quietly to Harrington. "That leg's badly broken, and he's losing blood. If we don't get him out of here soon, loyalty won't matter. He'll die beside his friend regardless." The irony was not lost on any of them. Just hours earlier, they had been engaged in fierce combat with German forces defending this very territory. Wehrmacht soldiers had fallen back toward the Rhine, leaving behind equipment, supplies, and apparently their military working dogs. The shepherd lying dead beneath Rex wore a similar collar, marked with the name Bruno, and both animals bore the distinctive training markers of the German military's renowned canine corps. Sergeant Harrington made a decision that would have seemed absurd to some in the middle of an active combat zone. With enemy positions still unknown, he ordered his men to save an enemy's dog. Perhaps it was the exhaustion of too many months at war, Or perhaps it was the recognition that some bonds transcended the arbitrary lines humans drew on maps. Either way, his squad did not question the order. Private First Class Robert Chun, whose family had immigrated from China to San Francisco's Chinatown district, had a particular way with animals. He approached from a different angle, speaking in soft, melodic tones that seemed incongruous with the devastation surrounding them. "Nobody's going to hurt you, boy. Nobody's going to hurt your friend. You did good. You stayed. Now let us help." The words themselves mattered less than the tone, gentle, reassuring, devoid of threat. Rex's amber eyes tracked Chin's movements, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tension in the dog's powerful shoulders began to ease. Blood continued to seep from the wound in his leg, staining the mud beneath him a darker shade of brown. Accounts from military historians, particularly those compiled in wartime records held by the Library of Congress, indicate that German military dogs underwent rigorous training that bonded them not only to handlers, but to other dogs in their units, creating pack dynamics that often proved as strong as those between human soldiers. Rex and Bruno had likely trained together, worked together, and survived countless dangers together until this cold March morning when survival became a solitary burden. O'Brien placed the hardtack closer, then retreated several steps. Hunger and injury fought against loyalty in Rex's calculating mind. The dog's nose twitched, his body trembling from cold and shock, his wounded leg tucked protectively against his body. Then, in a gesture that spoke volumes about trust's fragile nature, Rex stretched his neck forward, still maintaining contact with Bruno's body, and gently took the offered food. "That's it," Chun whispered. "Good boy." Mitchell used the moment to edge closer with a blanket from his pack. If they could get the blanket over Rex, they could immobilize him long enough to splint the broken leg and transport him to the aid station. But any sudden movement could shatter the tenuous trust they were building, and a cornered, injured German shepherd was potentially as dangerous as any enemy soldier. The minutes stretched like hours as the squad worked with infinite patience. The delicate dance of trust continued as Mitchell positioned himself within striking distance, the blanket folded carefully in his hands. Rex watched every movement with the hypervigilance of a trained military animal, his body language a complex mixture of pain, exhaustion, and unwavering dedication to his fallen companion. The other men formed a loose semicircle, ready to assist but careful not to appear threatening or overwhelming. "On my mark," Harrington whispered, and Mitchell nodded. In his years working with animals back in Montana, Mitchell had learned that confidence and gentleness were not mutually exclusive. In fact, they were essential partners in handling frightened or injured creatures. He moved with practiced smoothness, draping the blanket over Rex's shoulders in one fluid motion, while simultaneously speaking in calm, reassuring tones. Rex flinched but did not bite. His training had been thorough. These dogs were taught discipline and control even in extremis, but more than that, some instinct seemed to recognize that these strange soldiers in their olive-drab uniforms meant him no harm. He allowed the blanket to remain, even as his eyes darted between the men surrounding him, seeking any sign of threat. Chun produced a canteen of water, pouring some into his cupped palm and extending it toward the injured shepherd. Rex's tongue, dry and cracked from shock and dehydration, lapped tentatively at first, then with increasing eagerness. The simple act of providing water seemed to unlock something in the dogs, consciousness, a recognition that these humans were offering care rather than violence. "We need to move him now," Mitchell said urgently. "That leg needs proper splinting and he's hypothermic. We've got maybe 30 minutes before it's too late." The problem remained: how to move Rex without forcing him to abandon Bruno. The dead shepherd weighed at least 70 pounds, and Rex's protective positioning made any attempt to separate them a potential trigger for the injured dog's remaining aggression. These animals had been trained together, fought together, and Rex clearly understood his companion was gone, yet the bond transcended even death's finality. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Morrison, commanding officer of the battalion's forward elements, arrived at the crater's edge and surveyed the unusual scene with a mixture of bemusement and respect. Morrison, a career officer from Virginia's military tradition, had seen many strange sights in this terrible war, but a squad of American soldiers risking themselves for an enemy's dog ranked among the most peculiar. "Sergeant Harrington, what exactly are you doing?" Morrison asked, though his tone suggested curiosity rather than censure. "Saving a life, sir," Harrington replied simply. "This dog wouldn't leave his friend. Seems wrong to make him die for that." Morrison considered this, his weathered face creased with thought. The Allied advance was ahead of schedule, and this particular sector had been secured hours earlier. German forces were in full retreat toward the Rhine, and the greatest danger now came from sporadic artillery fire rather than direct engagement. Historical records from the 21st Army Group, documented in post-war military analyses, confirm that by late March of 1945, the Western Front had essentially collapsed for German forces, with organized resistance becoming increasingly rare. "Carry on," Morrison said after a moment. "But make it quick. We're moving out in 1 hour." With the colonel's tacit approval, the squad moved to execute their rescue plan. Chun and O'Brien worked together to fashion a makeshift stretcher from 2 rifles and the blanket, while Mitchell prepared splinting materials from broken wood planks scavenged from a nearby destroyed farmhouse. The improvisation was born from necessity. Their standard medical supplies included nothing designed for veterinary care. Yet these men adapted with the resourcefulness that characterized the American soldiers' approach to unexpected challenges. "Here's what we're going to do," Harrington explained to his team, his voice carrying the calm authority of a leader who had earned his men's trust through countless shared dangers. "We move both dogs together. Rex won't let us separate them, so we don't try. We get them both to the aid station and we let Rex say goodbye properly, understood?" The men nodded, recognizing the wisdom in this approach. Forcing separation would only traumatize Rex further and potentially result in injuries to the soldiers or worse, forcing them to harm the dog in self-defense. By respecting the bond between the 2 shepherds, they honored something fundamental that transcended the war's brutal calculus. Mitchell approached Rex again, this time with a piece of rope fashioned into a gentle muzzle. "Easy, boy. This is to protect both of us. You understand that, don't you?" The dog's ears perked forward, listening to the tone if not comprehending the words. When Mitchell slipped the rope over Rex's snout, the shepherd offered only token resistance, as if recognizing the necessity of the restraint. With infinite care, Chen and O'Brien slid the stretcher beneath both dogs. Bruno's body had stiffened with rigor mortis, making the task grimmer and more difficult, but the men worked with quiet dignity, treating the dead animal with the same respect they would show a fallen soldier. Rex watched every movement, his amber eyes tracking their hands, but he remained calm under the blanket's comforting weight. The splinting of Rex's broken leg required 3 men: Mitchell to apply the splint, Harrington to hold the dog steady, and Chun to keep Rex's head calm through continuous gentle stroking and soft words. The shepherd whimpered when Mitchell straightened the fractured limb, a sound so achingly vulnerable that O'Brien had to turn away momentarily, his 19-year-old heart still tender enough to be wounded by another creature's pain. "Almost done, boy," Mitchell murmured as he secured the splint with strips of cloth torn from a medic's bandage roll. "You're being very brave." According to veterinary medical practices documented in military field manuals of the era, the splinting technique Mitchell employed was rudimentary but effective. Straighten the limb, pad the splint to prevent pressure sores, and secure firmly enough to prevent movement but not so tightly as to cut off circulation. The fact that he accomplished this in a bomb crater under combat conditions spoke to both his skill and the unusual calmness Rex displayed once he understood these humans were helping rather than hurting. The journey from crater to aid station covered nearly 400 yards of churned earth, debris-strewn roads, and the general devastation that marked the path of modern warfare's terrible efficiency. 4 soldiers carried the stretcher, Harrington and O'Brien at the front, Chun and Mitchell at the rear, while 2 others provided security, their rifles ready should any remaining German forces attempt interference. Rex's weight, combined with Bruno's, made the burden considerable, yet not one man complained. The battalion aid station had been established in a partially intact barn on the outskirts of a village whose name appeared on no American maps, one of countless small German settlements that had found themselves directly in the path of history's largest military conflict. Captain David Rosenthal, the battalion's chief medical officer from Brooklyn, New York, looked up from bandaging a soldier's shrapnel wound when Harrington's squad arrived carrying their unusual patients. "Sergeant, we're set up to treat humans, not—" Rosenthal began, then stopped when he saw Rex's eyes. The captain had served as a physician at Kings County Hospital before the war, where he had learned that suffering recognized no boundaries of species, race, or nationality. "Put them over there, by the supply crates? Let me finish with Private Anderson, and I'll see what I can do." The aid station bustled with controlled chaos medics moving between wounded men, plasma bottles hanging from improvised stands, the smell of antiseptic fighting a losing battle against the stench of blood and gangrene. Yet when Harrington's squad laid the stretcher down, several of the wounded soldiers turned to look, their pain-glazed eyes showing flickers of curiosity and, surprisingly, concern. "That a German dog, Sarge?" asked a corporal with his arm in a sling, his Carolina drawl making the question sound more curious than accusatory. "He is," Harrington confirmed. "He's also a soldier who wouldn't leave his buddy behind. Figured that earned him some consideration." The corporal nodded slowly, understanding something unspoken. Every man in that barn had seen friends fall, had felt the terrible weight of survivor's guilt, had understood the bonds that formed between those who faced death together. If a dog could feel the same loyalty, perhaps there was something universal in that devotion that transcended the arbitrary divisions of human conflict. Captain Rosenthal approached the stretcher, his medical bag in hand, and knelt beside Rex. The dog's breathing had grown more labored during the transport, his body temperature dropping despite the blanket's insulation. Rosenthal had no formal veterinary training, but anatomy was anatomy, and shock manifested similarly across species. He examined Mitchell's splint work with a critical eye, then nodded approval. "Good field dressing. The leg should heal if we prevent infection. But the bigger concern is shock and blood loss." Rosenthal looked up at Harrington. "He needs warmth, fluids, and rest. I can give him a shot of morphine for the pain, but beyond that, we're limited. I'm not even sure the correct dosage for a dog this size." "Do your best, sir," Harrington said simply. "That's all any of us can do." What followed was an improvised course of veterinary medicine that would have horrified trained animal doctors, but represented the best possible care under impossible circumstances. Rosenthal administered a conservative dose of morphine, calculated based on Rex's estimated body weight and the captain's intuitive understanding of pharmacology. He cleaned and dressed the leg wound with antiseptic resplinted with proper medical supplies, and covered Rex with additional blankets scavenged from the supply depot. Through it all, Rex maintained his vigil over Bruno, even sedated by morphine, even as the pain receded and exhaustion claimed him. The living shepherd kept one paw resting on his dead companion's fur. Military historians and animal behaviorists who later studied accounts of this incident, preserved in various personal memoirs and unit histories, noted that such loyalty was not uncommon among military working dogs. These animals formed bonds as deep and meaningful as any human friendship, perhaps deeper for their inability to rationalize or question the devotion they felt. Private O'Brien sat beside the stretcher, having appointed himself Rex's guardian. As Rex drifted in and out of morphine-induced sleep, the aid station continued its grim work of patching together the broken bodies that war produced with such terrible efficiency. Captain Rosenthal moved from patient to patient, his hands steady despite 48 hours without sleep, his voice calm even when delivering news no doctor ever wanted to give. Between treatments, he returned to check on Rex, monitoring the dog's pulse and respiration with the same diligence he showed his human patients. "His vitals are stabilizing," Rosenthal told Harrington during one such check. "The morphine's helping and his body temperature's coming up. If we can keep infection at bay, he's got a fighting chance." The question nobody wanted to ask hung in the air. What would they do with Rex once he recovered? German military dogs were technically enemy assets, trained to attack Allied soldiers, potentially dangerous even after their handlers had fled or fallen. Military regulations, though rarely applied to such unusual circumstances, theoretically required the destruction of enemy war animals just as captured weapons were disabled or destroyed. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison addressed this question when he visited the aid station that evening. The colonel had spent the intervening hours ensuring his battalion sector was secure, coordinating with adjacent units and filing reports about the day's operations. Now, standing in the lamplight beside the stretcher where Rex lay, Morrison confronted a decision that regulations had never anticipated. "The dog's behavior today shows remarkable character," Morrison said, choosing his words carefully. "He protected his fallen comrade, showed restraint when he could have attacked, and accepted help from soldiers he had every reason to view as enemies. That suggests intelligence and temperament beyond typical military animals." Harrington waited, knowing the colonel was working through the problem aloud. Morrison continued, "We're shipping wounded men back to field hospitals tomorrow. I see no reason why we can't include one additional casualty in that manifest. Let the veterinary corps at the rear echelon decide what to do with him. At minimum, he deserves proper medical care before any final determinations are made." The decision made, Morrison departed, leaving Harrington with a sense of relief he hadn't expected to feel over the fate of an enemy's dog. Perhaps that was war's strangest trick, how it could make enemies of people who had never wronged each other while simultaneously revealing the common humanity that connected all beings capable of loyalty and love. That night, Rex's condition improved markedly. The warmth, rest, and medical care combined to pull him back from shock's dangerous edge. He lapped water from a bowl O'Brien held for him, and even accepted small pieces of food, though his eyes continually returned to Bruno's still form. The dead shepherd had been covered with a tarp out of respect, but Rex seemed to know exactly where his companion lay. Corporal Jackson, a soldier recovering from a concussion, began talking to Rex in the quiet hours before dawn. Jackson, a farmer from rural Alabama, spoke about his own dogs back home hunting hounds who lived in the kennel behind his family's farmhouse, who howled at the moon and chased rabbits through the cotton fields. His voice, thick with nostalgia and the longing for home, seemed to comfort Rex, or perhaps the dog simply recognized the universal language of grief and separation that war inflicted on all its participants. Historical documentation from the U.S. Army Medical Department's records, preserved in the National Archives, indicates that field aid stations in the European theater treated not only human casualties but occasionally dealt with injured animals, horses, mules used for transport, and rarely captured enemy dogs. The care these animals received varied widely depending on the medical officer's attitudes, available resources, and tactical situations, but instances of compassionate treatment were more common than official records suggested. As the 24th of March dawned, Rex was strong enough to lift his head and observe his surroundings with clearer eyes. The morning brought a cold rain that turned the aid station's vicinity into a morass of mud and standing water, but inside the barn, relative warmth and dryness prevailed. Rex was scheduled for evacuation to the rear echelon along with 12 wounded American soldiers, an unusual manifest entry that required creative paperwork on the part of the battalion's administrative officer. Captain Rosenthal signed off on the medical necessity, and Lieutenant Colonel Morrison authorized the transport, and thus Rex became, however, temporarily a ward of the United States Army. Before the ambulance arrived, Harrington made a decision about Bruno. The dead shepherd deserved better than to be left in a tarp like refuse, discarded and forgotten. He organized a burial detail himself, O'Brien Chun, and Michelan. They interred Bruno in a plot behind the barn, marked with a simple wooden cross fashioned from ammunition crate slats. The name Bruno was carved into the crosspiece along with the date, 23rd March 1945. Rex watched the burial from his stretcher, his eyes following every movement as the soldiers lowered Bruno into the earth. Whether the dog understood death's finality remained unknowable, but something in his posture suggested acceptance. The tense vigilance that had characterized his protection of Bruno's body had eased, replaced by a quieter sadness that was, in its way, more heartbreaking for its resignation. "You did good, boy," O'Brien whispered, kneeling beside Rex and scratching behind the dog's ears. "You stayed with him to the end." Nobody could ask for more than that. The ambulance arrived mid-morning, a converted truck with a canvas top and red crosses painted on its sides. The driver, a technician 5th grade named Kowalski from Chicago, raised his eyebrows when he saw Rex on the manifest but made no comment. He had transported stranger cargo in this war once he had evacuated a battalion commander's pet monkey that had been wounded by grenade fragments. A German shepherd seemed positively conventional by comparison. Loading the wounded required careful coordination. Each man's injuries demanded specific positioning to minimize pain and prevent further damage during transport. Rex, still on his makeshift stretcher, was secured between two human patients who seemed more than willing to share their space with the four-legged casualty. Private Anderson, the soldier Captain Rosenthal had been treating when Rex first arrived, actually smiled when he saw the dog being loaded. "Glad you made it, fella," Anderson said, his voice weak but sincere. "You hang in there." The journey to the field hospital covered 30 miles of cratered roads, temporary bridges spanning blown culverts, and countryside that bore the terrible scars of mechanized warfare's passage. The ambulance jolted and swayed, its suspension inadequate for the ruined infrastructure, and inside, men groaned, despite the morphine that dulled their pain. Through it all, Rex remained quiet, his morphine dosage carefully calibrated to keep him comfortable without rendering him unconscious. At the field hospital, a cluster of large tents and requisition buildings in a town that had been liberated 2 weeks earlier Rex's arrival caused considerable stir. Major Helen Richardson, the chief nurse and a veterinarian's daughter from Oregon, took immediate interest in the case. She examined Mitchell's splint work, Captain Rosenthal's wound dressing, and Rex's overall condition with professional thoroughness. "Whoever did this preliminary work knew what they were doing," Richardson commented. "The splint probably saved the leg. Another few hours without treatment, and we'd be looking at amputation." She arranged for Rex to be housed in a section of the hospital's supply depot that had been converted into temporary kennels for the military working dogs attached to various Allied units. There, Rex found himself among American and British dogs, mostly German shepherds and Belgian Malinois, trained for scouting, message carrying, and mine detection. The irony was not lost on Major Richardson. The field hospital's veterinary section, though unofficial and operating outside standard military organizational charts, had evolved from necessity rather than planning. Major Richardson had recognized early in the campaign that military working dogs required medical care, just as soldiers did, and she had taken it upon herself to provide that care whenever circumstances permitted. Her efforts had gained tacit approval from the hospital's commanding officer, who recognized practical value when he saw it, regardless of whether regulations explicitly authorized the practice. Rex's rehabilitation became a project that engaged not only Richardson, but also several of the wounded soldiers recovering in the hospital wards. Men who could walk visited the kennels, bringing scraps of food saved from mess hall trays, sitting beside Rex's cage to talk or simply share silent companionship. Something about the German shepherd's story resonated with these battle-weary veterans perhaps. They recognized their own experiences reflected in Rex's loyalty, or perhaps caring for another wounded being provided distraction from their own pain and trauma. Corporal Marcus Webb, recovering from a gunshot wound to his shoulder, appointed himself Rex's primary companion. Webb, a teacher from Philadelphia in civilian life, spoke to Rex about literature, history, and philosophy topics that seemed absurd to discuss with a dog. Yet Webb insisted that Rex understood more than anyone gave him credit for. Whether this was true or merely Webb's projection of his own need for intelligent conversation mattered less than the therapeutic effect it had on both man and dog. The ancient Greeks understood loyalty, Webb told Rex one afternoon, his good hand stroking the shepherd's head. They called it pistis, faithfulness, reliability, trust. You embodied that virtue when you refused to leave Bruno. That makes you noble in the truest sense. Regardless of what uniform your handlers wore, Rex's leg healed slowly but surely over the following weeks. Major Richardson changed his dressings daily, monitoring for any signs of infection that would require more aggressive treatment. The fracture had been clean a fortunate break, if such terminology could be applied to broken bones, and with proper immobilization and rest, the bone knit itself back together following nature's ancient protocols. During this period, the question of Rex's ultimate fate remained unresolved. Military regulations offered no clear guidance on captured enemy animals, and different officers held different opinions. Some argued that Rex should be euthanized as a potential threat. Others suggested he could be retrained for Allied service. Still, others thought he should simply be released as a stray once his injuries healed. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison visited the field hospital in mid-April and specifically asked to see Rex, the shepherd, now able to stand and walk with a pronounced limp, regarded the colonel with those intelligent amber eyes that had so impressed Morrison during their first encounter. Morrison crouched beside the dog, extending his hand for Rex to sniff, and spoke words that would determine the shepherd's future. "This dog showed more courage and loyalty than many men I've known," Morrison said to Major Richardson. "He deserves a chance at a real life, not destruction or indefinite kenneling. Can he be rehabilitated for civilian adoption?" Richardson considered carefully before answering. His training was military and extensive by all indications, but he's also shown remarkable adaptability accepting care from former enemies, bonding with patients here, displaying no aggression even when in pain or frightened. Yes, I believe he could be successfully rehabilitated and adopted. It would require the right home, someone with experience handling working dogs, but it's definitely possible. Morrison nodded decisively. Then that's what we'll do. Process him as a displaced animal, document his medical care, and when the war ends, he paused, recognizing that the war's end was now a matter of weeks rather than months. Find him a home where loyalty like his will be appreciated. Documentation in Morrison's personal papers, later donated to the Virginia Military Institute archives, confirms this conversation and his subsequent official memorandum authorizing Rex's rehabilitation and eventual civilian adoption. The war in Europe ended on the 8th of May, 1945, when Germany surrendered unconditionally to the Allied forces. The news reached the field hospital through radio broadcasts and official communiques, sparking celebrations tempered by exhaustion and the knowledge of how much blood had been spilled to reach this moment. In the kennels, Rex observed the unusual behavior of the humans around him, their laughter, their tears, their embraces, with the patient incomprehension of a being whose concerns remained simpler and more immediate than geopolitical outcomes. Major Richardson worked through the bureaucratic complexities of processing Rex's adoption. Through the remainder of May and into June, the task proved more complicated than anticipated, as military regulations simply had not contemplated the scenario of adopting enemy military animals into civilian life. She persevered, however, driven by a conviction that Rex represented something important, a symbol of loyalty transcending human conflicts, a living reminder that nobility could be found in unexpected places. The breakthrough came when Morrison contacted a colleague in the War Department who had handled similar cases involving military working dogs being retired from service. With appropriate documentation, Rex could be classified as a war relief animal, a category typically applied to mascots and pets that had accompanied military units but which could, with creative interpretation, cover Rex's unique situation. The paperwork required careful crafting to elide certain details about Rex's German military origins, while emphasizing his rescue by American forces and his rehabilitation under U.S. Army medical care. By mid-June, Rex was medically cleared for transport and adoption. His leg had healed remarkably well, leaving only a slight limp that Major Richardson assured prospective adopters would likely disappear entirely with time and exercise. The question became, who would adopt a former German military dog, trained for warfare, carrying the psychological scars of battle and loss? The answer came from an unexpected source. Sergeant William Harrington, who had initiated Rex's rescue back in March, wrote to Major Richardson requesting information about adopting the dog. Harrington's letter, preserved in Richardson's personal correspondence collection at the Oregon Historical Society, explained that he would be mustering out of service in July and returning to his family's farm in Pennsylvania. The farm needed a good working dog, and Harrington felt a responsibility to the animal whose life he had helped save. Rex showed me what real loyalty looks like, Harrington wrote. In a war that seemed designed to destroy every decent human quality, that dog reminded me that some things, devotion, courage, faithfulness, survive, even the worst humanity can create. He deserves a home where those qualities will be valued, and I can provide that. Richardson approved the adoption immediately. The process required additional paperwork. Harrington had to provide proof of adequate facilities, demonstrate knowledge of large dog care, and sign liability waivers acknowledging Rex's military background, but by late July, all requirements had been met. Rex would travel to Pennsylvania with Harrington when the sergeant's discharge came through in August. The farewell at the field hospital was more emotional than anyone anticipated. Corporal Webb, now fully recovered and awaiting his own return to Philadelphia, spent an hour with Rex, speaking to the dog about the life awaiting him in Pennsylvania's countryside. Private Anderson, whose arm had healed sufficiently for him to return to duty, brought Rex a gift, a new collar civilian-made, with Rex embossed in brass letters, no military markings or Wehrmacht insignia to remind the dog of his previous service. On the 15th of August 1945, Harrington and Rex departed for the United States aboard a transport ship carrying returning servicemen. The voyage across the Atlantic took 2 weeks, during which Rex adapted to shipboard life with the same remarkable flexibility he had shown throughout his recovery. He became a fixture on deck, accepting attention from sailors and soldiers who heard his story and wanted to meet the German dog who wouldn't quit. They docked in New York on the 1st of September, and Harrington took Rex directly to Pennsylvania. The farm in rural Lancaster County sprawled across 200 acres of rolling hills, cornfields and pastures where dairy cows grazed in pastoral contentment. It was as far removed from the blasted landscapes of war-torn Germany as any place could be, and Rex approached his new home with cautious curiosity. The transition was not without challenges. Rex occasionally showed signs of his military training, alerting to distant sounds, displaying protective behaviors around the farm's perimeter, but Harrington worked patiently to redirect these instincts toward useful farm work. Rex learned to help herd cattle, to alert when strangers approached, to be gentle with the farm's other animals while remaining vigilant against genuine threats. Over time, the limp disappeared entirely. Over time, the wariness in Rex's eyes softened. Over time, the German shepherd who had refused to abandon his fallen comrade found peace in the Pennsylvania countryside, his loyalty redirected toward a new family who understood exactly what his devotion was worth. Rex lived another 11 years, dying peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1956, surrounded by Harrington's children who had grown up with the former German military dog as their guardian and playmate. He was buried on the farm beneath an oak tree with a marker that read simply, "Rex loyal to the end." The story of the German shepherd who refused to leave his injured colleague and the American soldiers who saved him became part of the Harrington family's oral history, passed down through generations as a reminder that courage and loyalty recognize no national boundaries, that compassion can flourish even in war's darkest moments, and that sometimes the most profound acts of humanity involve recognizing the humanity, or in this case, the nobility in beings we might otherwise have considered enemies. In a conflict that killed millions and devastated continents, one dog's faithfulness and one sergeant's decision to honor that faithfulness represented something essential about the better angels of our nature qualities that survive even when everything else seems lost to violence and hate.